Welcome to Exodus session 6. Today we will continue part 2 of Law and Covenant. Just a brief review. We've been in the desert at Mount Sinai for a while now. Jethro has come to visit his father-in-law Moses, or his son-in-law Moses, and has given him advice regarding legal codes and regarding how to deal with different problems within the Israelite community, and to be a fair judge and to share that responsibility with other elders of the group, so that he would not become so burdened. God has given the 10 Commandments. Moses has gone up on the mountain and spoken with God and received those commandments, brought them down. And Moses and the elders have gone up to Mount Sinai and stayed up there for 40 days and was within the presence of God for 40 days and 40 nights. God has given him worshiping instructions, but when Moses came down from the mountain, he was met with the golden calf episode, which you can read in chapter 32 of Exodus. Now, on a timeline, as far as we've been going since the very beginning of this course in part 1 last fall, this is where we are now, right here. We're the 40 years in the wilderness. We have started at creation with Genesis chapters 1 and 2. We've followed through with all the generations and the flooding story with Noah and the ark. We've researched the different patriarchs and what they contributed to the meaning of the forming of an Israelite community. And they journeyed into Egypt and resided there over 400 years, and then exited from Egypt into the Exodus experience. And so now we are getting towards the end of the Exodus experience. We have one more lesson in Exodus, and then we'll be going on to Leviticus, which still continues the Exodus experience. So this is part of the covenant section of Exodus book. 19 through 24 are the chapters. Another word of a reminder, the word theophany means to visually have some sign of God's presence. In this case, on the mountain covered with clouds and smoke and sometimes fire. And then later, once the tabernacle is built, we will see that in the tent of meeting, God is present there in the form of a cloud. So in convening the covenant, chapter 24, verse 4 starts out, Moses carefully wrote down all the Lord's instructions. Early the next morning, Moses got up and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. He also set up 12 pillars, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he sent some of the young Israelite men to present burnt offerings and to sacrifice bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Here is what an Old Testament earthen altar may have looked like. It would have probably been a combination of stone, pebbles, and clay. This would, of course, not last or endure for centuries, so we don't have any real examples of it from ancient times like we might have of a stone, completely stone structure. The clay itself being earthen and the pebbles and stones therein would have absorbed some of the liquids that were on the altar. And then on to verse 9, it says, when Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel climbed up the mountain, there they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there seemed to be a surface of brilliant blue lapis lazuli, as clear as the sky itself. And though these nobles of Israel gazed upon God, he did not destroy them. In fact, they ate a covenant meal, eating and drinking in his presence. The notable thing about this is that they are communing with God directly. Of course, God is not eating, but he's also present and makes his presence known that he is there. And so not only Moses, but now the elders of Israel also have an experience of face-to-face with God. Talking about worship, there is much detail and much verbiage about worship and how Israel should worship. God is very serious about not being worshiped in ways that resemble Canaanite practices. And when they say Canaanite practices, it means the practices of any of the cultures around them, whether it's the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Amorites, or any of the tribes that are listed in the book of Exodus and in the land of Canaan that dwelled there. So this theme runs throughout the Old Testament and carries over into the New Testament as well. The social and religious laws of Israel are not isolated from each other, but they intermingle. So to Israel, they are part of all of life and they work together, not as we do in Western culture, where we try to keep the two separated from each other, religious versus community or social laws. So why are they having to stay in the desert for so many years or for so long? The purpose of the wilderness wandering is to train up the Israelites to become a nation that obeys and worships God. That in turn was to be used to bless all of the other nations. This training begins at Mount Sinai with giving the laws and renewing the covenant. Looking into Leviticus, the book of laws, in chapter 18, it says, and then the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. I am the Lord your God. Do not act like the people in Egypt, where you used to live, or like the people of Canaan, where I am taking you. You must not imitate their way of life. You must obey all my regulations and be careful to obey my decrees, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey my decrees and my regulations, you will find life through them. I am the Lord. So the sojourning in the wilderness is to help to renew the meaning of belonging to one God and what that life should look like. Remember, we're bringing generations out of Egypt where they may have been acculturated or assimilated ideas that were practiced there. And we want to have scraped off all of those old ways and begin a new way as under the new covenant of, or renewed covenant with Yahweh. So the sacred versus the secular. The covenant laws did not recognize a difference between sacred or religious laws and between secular or civil laws. All the laws are divinely originated. Two kinds of law were given, casuistic and apodictic. Casuistic means if this happens, then that will be the result. So casuistic is what we would commonly call case law. It is based on precedents and is usually in the form of an if-then conditional statement. Moral principles are applied to determine right and wrong in particular situations. So casuistic law is necessary because it is not possible to apply general commands directly to actual moral situations. An example from the Old Testament. When a man strikes the eye of his male slave or the eye of his female slave and destroys it, he shall send him away free for his eye. So if he causes physical damage that causes a disability, then he has to release the person from slavery. Apodictic law are laws that are presented as absolute and unconditional, and they are usually expressed in an imperative form. These are laws that we see in the Ten Commandments, such as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on. They are a set of commands that should be followed without any question. So there are parallels to other ancient law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, which is most often used as a comparison. The Old Testament embeds the laws into a narrative, presenting the laws as part of an overarching story. The Old Testament has woven the law into the story of Israel from its very earliest beginnings, with Abraham through and all the way through the monarchy of Kings David and Solomon. There's a model called a suzerainty model. It is a law that was ancient even in the time of Israel, and it was practiced throughout the Middle East. And you may recognize this law because it also is similar to the model of lord and vassal from the Middle Ages. In this arrangement, the king or lord, or in this case it is God or Yahweh, would begin by telling the subjects, in this case Israel, who he is and what he has done. Such as, if you recall in Exodus 20, verse 3, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of slavery from the land of Egypt. The suzerainty model of lord and vassal would tell them that full obedience is required of them. The covenant would include rewards or blessings and punishments or curses for disobedience. These would be what we would call the terms and conditions. We have read some of the conditions in chapters 20 through 24, but there's a really extensive list in Deuteronomy chapters 27 through 28. And in fact, Deuteronomy is almost all about the pattern of covenant law. So better than I can explain here is Dr. Amy Jill, who will be able to give you a much better description of what's going on than I can.
In the previous lecture, we discussed the covenant both as a literary form well known throughout the ancient Near East and as a particular way that the ancient Israelites attempted to describe the relationship between themselves and their God. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of covenants, first by looking at the difference between life within a covenantal community, such as that which ancient Israel had, and life in a contemporary legal system, such as what we have in the United States, because they really are quite different systems. And I hope through this to be able to show the distinction between covenant and law, and why, in fact, translating Torah instruction as law is probably not as accurate as we might want. So when we look at this material, we'll look at it in terms of purpose and sanctions and signs, because there are differences all the way through. Here I'm basing my work on earlier scholarship by George Mendenhall. In terms of purpose, nice place to begin, covenants set up something new, like a contract. There wasn't something there, you make a contract, then you have something. So covenants in terms of purpose create new relationships, often by using older forms like the suzerainty vassal model. But something new is being created and you sign on to something new. You have a choice as to whether you want to enter a covenant or not. Here perhaps the best analogy for covenants is the idea of marriage, which is in fact a contract between you and your spouse. Legal systems, you have no choice. You're born into the system. I can't go up to the lawmakers and say, I don't particularly like this law. I want to be able to have a say on whether I want to abide by this or not. One doesn't. The law is simply there. We as citizens can protest, but for the most part, we don't every 5 or 6 years renew the entire law code or even recite it. Because the covenant requires some sort of assent, because we sign on to it differently, it's often marked by external signs, such as a public pledge. We can already see that the covenants are marked by external signs, most notably the Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision. Law codes don't have such signs. We're simply in them. No one has to come up to you if you're in the United States and ask you if you're part of a particular law code. But they might want to know if you're part of a covenant community, because it's not necessarily the case that you would be. And it helps if you have an external sign, not that this one is one you'd want to display in public. Women within the covenant community do not bear this external sign, and that's because in antiquity, when these covenants were developed, we are dealing with a patriarchal society, not patriarch in the sense of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but patriarch in the sense of determined by male interests. In terms of sanctions, rewards and punishments within a covenantal model are meted out by the suzerain. In the biblical case, the suzerain would be God, and sometimes the suzerain's agents. But when we see those sanctions as spelled out in the biblical covenantal forms, those are the blessings and the curses, right? If you abide by the covenant, you are blessed. If you break the covenant, you are cursed. The covenantal model, as we've seen, has problems with theodicy, the justice of God. Why sometimes do the wicked prosper? Why aren't they punished? But that's not a problem that we have within the legal system. In the legal system, in fact, if you behave wickedly, you are in fact punished. And you are punished not by a divine model, but by laws of the state. So the sanctions within the covenantal model for Moses meted out by God. The sanctions within a legal system such as that which we have meted out by the state, and moreover, when the state metes out punishments, that's all it does. The covenant, you get rewarded if you behave properly. There are blessings. The state tends not to bless us if we follow the laws. The state only kicks in when we do something that we weren't supposed to do, when we transgress the laws. In terms of geography, or where the regulations are applicable, if you are a member of a covenant community, that covenant goes with you wherever you go. It fits along with the idea of God being manifest in history and over time, rather than located in only one particular space. So if you are a member of the Israelite covenant community and you happen to move to Egypt or are forcibly moved to Babylon, you are still a member of that covenant community. And where the laws of the state in which you are living differ from the terms of the covenant, ideally, the covenant will prevail. And we'll see that many lectures hence when we get to the book of Daniel, where Daniel is brought into Babylon, and the Babylonians make laws which force him to transgress the covenant. And Daniel says, absolutely not, I refuse. He abides by the laws of the covenant. That's, in fact, how he lands in the lion's den. Laws, obviously, are territorially bound. We don't move laws from place to place. For example, one can drive, heaven knows how fast, on the Autobahn in Germany, 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. But you cannot do that in most streets of the United States, or those sanctions kick in. In other words, the police come to get you. Covenants have not only a geographical concern, in other words, they're portable, they last wherever you go, but they also have a temporal focus. Specifically, covenants tend to be future-oriented. We might think of them as external promises. If you sign onto a covenant, as if you enter into a marriage or engage in a legal contract, the covenant has a concern for the future. That's when it kicks in. Laws, on the other hand, are past-oriented. They are already on the books. We don't have to think about them. And in fact, until we wind up breaking them, or we get caught breaking them, we usually don't. They don't, in that sense, operate as a social reality. When we go through life in the United States, we follow U.S. laws. We tend not to think about them. We simply do them. But the idea of the covenant is it's future-oriented. You're always engaged in it. You always think about it. There's also a difference in terms of solemnity. If you make a covenant, particularly if you make a covenant with God, there has to be some sort of, symbolic process. Again, think about a marriage. Yes, you can get married by just going to a justice of the peace and having a couple of words said on you, but marriage in a traditional sense is a solemn concern, with flowers and caterers and a white dress and a groom and rings, and at the very least you register for China. It's a ceremony. That's a covenant. The covenant we have in the biblical code is certainly a ceremony. It's certainly something you would pay attention to. This is the covenant from the Bible. For 3 days at Sinai, the people remained in a state of ritual purity. They washed their clothes, they did not engage in sexual intercourse, and they observed the injunction put upon them by Moses, "Take heed that you don't go up the mountain or even touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death." That's pretty solemn. "No hand shall touch the person who touches the mountain, but you shall stone him." You don't even get a second-order touch. It's that important. The covenant is then established in theophany, by manifestation of God. Mount Sinai is wrapped in smoke, the Bible tells us, because the Lord descended upon it like fire. And the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a great oven, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. That's solemn. That's important. By the way, it's probably ahistorical. This seems to be the description of either of a volcano or perhaps a volcano and an earthquake together. But there are no active volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula. The people knew what a covenant was when you make it with God. We don't have that with the legal system. Every once in a while you can see a president or a governor using a special pen and enacting something into law. But for the most part, laws are simply created day after day in various localities, local, state, federal, and we tend to pay very little attention to it. It doesn't have that sort of solemnity. If we think about the rationale for obedience, we also have a difference. One is obedient to the covenant because that's what one wants to do. You sign on to the stipulations because you want to do so. In this sense, again, covenants are like marriage. When you marry someone, ideally, you and the person to whom you're married try to help each other out, work for the best. And sometimes if your husband or your wife asks you to do something, you might actually do it because you want to, and not because there's a law on the books saying you have to. That's covenant. Law, you have no choice. It's simply there. It's not voluntary. The rationale for obedience is it's part of the system. You have no choice. Some Christian theologians, following hints in St. Paul from the New Testament, have suggested that the laws of the Torah are there in order for the people to earn their way into heaven. In other words, if you follow enough of those laws, God will reward you. There'd be a scale at the end of your life. And if your obedience was heavier than your disobedience, then you got into heaven. And if your disobedience was heavier, you'd land in hell. But that's actually not the way covenants function at all, either the biblical version or indeed Judaism ever since. One does not follow the law in order to earn one's place into God's kingdom. The covenant already tells you your place in election is presupposed. It's already there once the covenant is made. And then you follow the stipulations because that's what you have agreed to. Again, the covenant is like a marriage. Covenantal stipulations, just for a word of definition, are called mitzvot. Mitzvot translates the Hebrew term commandment. But the term commandments, plural, but the term mitzvot, mitzvah in the singular, has a different connotation. You may have heard the expression bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is actually an Aramaic term meaning son of the commandment. And bat mitzvah is daughter of the commandment. Eastern Europeans would say bas mitzvah. This means as well that not only are the mitzvot commandments, but they have the connotation of good deeds. There's an expression to do a mitzvah, which does not mean to follow a law. It means to do something that God would want you to do. So the commandments already have, in terms of connotation, a sense of something good, of something pleasing, in the same way you'd want to do something for your husband or for your wife. I tend not to think of the U.S. legal system in that type of marital terms. Let's move to those regulations themselves. Fascinating stuff. Among the most well-known of the so-called ritual laws, as opposed to those moral laws like don't oppress a widow or be nice to your neighbor, are the dietary regulations. Most people are familiar in general with some of these. The idea that within the covenant community, one is not supposed to eat pork, one is not supposed to eat shellfish, one is not supposed to consume any food with blood in it. You can't eat carrion like a vulture, for example. The question is, why are they there, right? So we'll look at some of these laws, not only the dietary regulations, but also some other laws. Why? Because in order to understand the biblical law code, I think it helps not to separate all the laws out and say, this law is here for this particular reason and that law is here for another reason, but rather to see if they hold something in common. Is there some sort of rationale behind at least many, if not most, of these ritual laws, or are they simply arbitrary? So in addition to looking at laws regarding diet, we might consider laws that say you can't crossbreed animals, or you can't plant a field with two different types of crops, or indeed you can't wear clothing made of two different materials like linen and wool. Men can't wear women's clothes, women can't wear men's clothes. Where do these come from? And how would we come to understand them? Before we begin specific explanations, just a word or two on some of these dietary concerns. Many of my students, when I start pointing out to them this business about not eating pork, and I live in Tennessee where barbecue is really, it's the state dish, right? They don't understand it. And they say, this is primitive, it's silly, it's just, it makes no sense to them. But in fact, all cultures maintain dietary regulations and all religions maintain dietary regulations. The only reason the biblical ones look silly is because they're not biblical people. And I think some of the dietary regulations that we have today might have looked peculiar to people back then. For example, Christians have particular dietary regulations in terms of positive injunctions. Most Christians will go into church and at some point participate in a Eucharistic celebration or a communion meal. And even on the more general cultural level, we think about eating Easter eggs at Easter time. And if you don't, there's something not quite right with you. Jews will eat matzah, unleavened bread, at Passover time to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. In the United States, we also have a kind of civil religion. What's Thanksgiving without turkey? Right? It's just not right. Or even going to a baseball game and not having a hot dog. These are part of our civil religions. And indeed, all cultures have, if not laws on the books, then a view that certain foods, although full of protein, nutritious, are simply forbidden to eat. Most people don't eat human flesh. We could. We simply don't want to. In certain cultures, things like sheep's heads and goat's eyes are delicacies. Not in my house. Because my children would simply revolt. We don't do that. We don't eat those foods because they're not part of our culture. We would feel peculiar with monkey brains and goat's eyes. For other cultures, perhaps some of our concerns with, pizza might look a little bit problematic, let alone what we get in some fast food restaurants. So we ought not to look at the biblical dietary regulations as peculiar in and of themselves. What we need to do is figure out why these particular regulations and not others. There have been several explanations regarding the dietary laws, And I think they all, to some extent, may have some validity, but I'm not convinced that they all work. The most common explanation my students give me when I say, well, why does the Bible have these laws, is that they are for hygiene purposes, right? Because the one thing that most of my students remember is that pig is forbidden. And they say, pig, if you don't cook it long enough, causes trichinosis, you can die. And then invariably somebody will raise her hand or his hand and say, well, I'm allergic to scallops, or I'm allergic to shrimp. So perhaps the people in the ancient world knew about allergies, and thereby they forbade pig because of health concerns, and shellfish again because of health concerns. I'm not convinced. Other people in the ancient Near East ate pig. They knew how to cook it. They knew if you didn't cook it long enough or properly, they would all die. They also knew about allergies. They also knew some people couldn't eat shellfish, and they also knew that sometimes shellfish got bacteria in them. It's not as if the Israelites were the only smart people in the ancient Near East or the only people who had doctors. Other cultures knew this as well, so I think there must be some other explanation. More recently, I've heard that some of these dietary regulations have to do with economics. The idea is one ought not to raise pigs because they eat a lot, but they don't really produce much back for you, right? Sheep, you can get wool, for example. Cows, you can get milk, but you can't get much out of a pig except for decent barbecue. They're expensive, so therefore don't raise them. But this business about economics, although it might work for pigs, really doesn't work for most of the other animals. If you want to raise an animal that's edible and cheap, raise bunny rabbits. They multiply quickly, they're easy to eat, they're easy to cook, but they're also forbidden according to the biblical law code, because the biblical law code forbids any animal that does not chew a cud and have a split hoof, and bunnies don't fall under that category. So that doesn't work. Another popular explanation is that pigs and rabbits, for example, were used by Canaanites as part of their religious practices. This is the view that says, well, the Canaanites are offering sacrifices to Baal and they're sacrificing pigs, so therefore don't eat pig because it might remind you of sacrifices to Baal. I don't buy that one either. It's true the Canaanites did sacrifice pigs, but they also sacrificed sheep and goats and bulls, and so did the ancient Israelites. If the idea is to avoid Baal culture, syncretism, the merging of religions, just give up on the sacrifices entirely. Perhaps a connection? I don't think so. And still others have proposed allegory. Isn't it fascinating how people keep wanting to find these explanations? Even in the first century, Philo of Alexandria, who we've mentioned before, said, you know, those laws are there for behavioral reasons. One ought not to act like a pig who hogs resources. Now, actually, that pun does not work in the Greek, which is the language Philo wrote, but it's apt, right? You don't want to act pig-like. You don't want to act like a vulture, stealing, eating carrion, picking on others' remains. So you don't eat vulture. This is the modern saying, you are what you eat. It could be. But there are certain animals that are forbidden that, at least in terms of metaphoric potential, make sense to me. Why not eat camel? Be like a camel and conserve resources, right? So the allegory may have some connection, but it doesn't really get me too far. And moreover, none of these examples provides me a means of moving from the dietary regulations to the other law codes. And what I'd like to be able to find is a rationale that gets me from what you can eat to what you can wear, to what you can plant, to what you can do with your animals. There's an anthropologist named Mary Douglas who a couple of decades ago set out what I think is probably the most helpful explanation. She looked at questions of categories and said that holiness, and holiness is something the biblical law codes are very much concerned with, holiness requires that individuals, plants, animals, materials conform to their particular categories, as if everything has a place. And if your categories get confused, if taxonomy, categorization is messed up, then you lose your holiness, as if holiness is connected to wholeness. You don't want category confusion. The idea is the Israelites are Israelites and the Canaanites are Canaanites, and you don't mix them. The classifications regarding food may seem arbitrary to us, but indeed they do fit a particular notion of category. For the ancient Israelites, the category of permissible animals, is an animal that both chews the cud and has a split hoof. And if an animal lacks either of these or both of these, the animal falls out of the appropriate category. Moving to shellfish. For the biblical law code, an animal that swims in the water and has fins and scales, fish, that's permitted. But if it lives in the water and it doesn't have fins and scales, it's out of place. And that would be things like clams and lobsters. They're defining their terms as to what's appropriate and what's not. In terms of planting two different crops in the same field, of course you wouldn't do that. That's category confusion. And of course you wouldn't wear garments made out of linen and wool because you don't want to mix. And of course a man wouldn't wear women's clothes and a woman wouldn't wear man's clothes because it's category confusion again. The biblical code is interested in categories. Everything needs to be in its place. And indeed the idea of categories follows all the way through, as well as to some other laws which have caused problems not only for ancient Israel, but in particular for people today interested in legislating sexual morality. I think this idea of category confusion actually explains what's going on when the Bible forbids homosexual action. And I think it would be irresponsible of me to give a lecture series on the Bible and not raise these particular questions because they are so prevalent in contemporary discussions about what we should and should not do. The Bible clearly forbids male homosexual activity. It says, paraphrasing the Hebrew here, "You, the male person, shall not lie with another male person as if he were a woman." Technically, the text reads, "Thou shalt not lie with a male the lyings of a woman. A male shall not treat another male sexually as if the other male were a female." Why is that on the books? Here are some of the explanations you'll find in the literature. Extremely common is the assertion that ancient Canaanites engaged in homosexual activity for ritual practices. This is sacred prostitution. They may well have, but we don't have any good evidence of that from Canaanite sources. The Bible hints at it. But to cast aspersions on one's enemy's sexual activities is very, very common. You don't like somebody, suggest the person you don't like is inappropriately having sex. Standard maledicta, it's a standard curse. A second argument is that homosexuality is forbidden because it involves a misuse of semen. The idea is here that whenever you, the male person, have sex, it should be for procreative purposes only and therefore only with a woman. It's true that the Bible does encourage procreation. A man is not to sleep with a woman while she's menstruating, which means he will sleep with her when she is in her most fertile period. But the Bible, on the other hand, does not condemn misuse of semen elsewhere. We have the example of Onan in Genesis chapter 38. And sometimes this example of Onan, who, as the text said, spills his seed upon the ground, is cited as an injunction against masturbation. But that's not, in fact, what Onan was doing. He was actually practicing birth control, coitus interruptus. And that was only in Onan's case, not in anyone else. Not for anyone else. In fact, the Bible never forbids masturbation. It never forbids oral sex if it's a man and a woman, and that's not going to let you conceive anything, or any other sort of sexual position between a man and a woman. Nor does it forbid sexual intercourse with a woman who's pregnant. She's not going to get pregnant again. Or sexual intercourse with a menopausal woman, although granted in the ancient Near East she might actually conceive if she's 90. But for most people this is not going to happen. Others have suggested that the laws against homosexuality are there because of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis chapter 19. Let's visit that for just a moment. Abraham's nephew Lot is in Sodom. At one point, two divine messengers, angels, come to visit him. And the men of Sodom, from the greatest to the least, crowd around Lot's door, and they bang on the door and they say, "Send out the strangers so that we may know them." Know can simply mean get to know someone. But know in the Bible, K-N-O-W, can have the technical sense of have sex with. And Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. And I think what these people are actually asking, these sodomites, is send these people out so that we might rape them. And since they're men, and the visitors are men, this becomes a homosexual concern. But actually what's going on with the Sodom and Gomorrah story is not so much a condemnation of homosexuality, it's a condemnation of rape and violence. And how do I know that? Because the same story of strangers in a town and townspeople saying, "Send out the stranger that we may know them," shows up in Judges chapter 19. And at that point, the people involved cast out a woman. We'll see this in a few lectures when we get to Judges. And she is raped to death. The concern here is violence, the power that the townspeople want to have over the strangers, and not homosexuality per se. It's true the Bible does not like homosexual activity. The question, however, remains why? And I simply come back to the idea that it's a question of category confusion. The ancient Near Eastern view of sex was a man penetrating a woman. For a man to penetrate a man, again, think of the wording, "Don't lie with a man the lyings of a woman," puts one male in the woman's role, and that's category confusion. By the way, in the Old Testament, there's no reference to lesbianism because the Old Testament view of human sexuality meant a man doing some sort of penetration. The New Testament picks up on that particular gap. There are a few of the many other notable laws, so we can end with a few, if not non-controversial, perhaps at least not quite so controversial. Let's move from homosexuality to abortion. The text never actually talks about abortion, but there is one passage that has been used by both pro-life and pro-choice advocates. This is Exodus 21. "When men strive together and hurt a pregnant woman so that she miscarries, but she herself is not hurt, the one who hurt her shall be fined. However, if any harm follows," as the biblical text says, which means if the mother dies as well, then the text goes on to say, "You shall give life for life, eye for eye, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise." This is the so-called lex talionis, the eye for an eye. So what does this mean? It means, at least according to the Hebrew text, miscarriage does not result in an eye for an eye and a life for a life. The biblical code here does not consider the fetus to be a fully formed human being. It becomes monetary compensation if the fetus is injured or dies. Compounding the problem, in some manuscripts of the Greek translation of this very passage, the Greek says, even if the fetus dies, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which means the biblical law code can be used either by pro-choice people or by pro-life people. It simply depends upon which manuscript and which textual tradition, the Greek or Hebrew, you want to depend on. The Bible is not easy when it comes to locating contemporary morality. With homosexuality, we worry about the rationale. With abortion, the text is not actually talking about the woman's choice here. This is when she's injured. But we can always debate whether the Bible considers the unborn to be a human being or something perhaps less. A couple more quick points. These are easier. According to Exodus chapter 34, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony in his hand, he did not know that his skin shone like rays of light. We've seen this before when we talked about the folk tale, about the hero being transformed, transfigured. And why is his skin shining? Shining because he had been talking to God. And the people become so afraid of his transfiguration that he has to wear a veil when he speaks to them. And then when he speaks to God, he takes his veil off. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Hebrew uses the term keren. It means a ray coming out of Moses. But when the Greek text translated the Hebrew, it read horns, and so we have the image of Moses with horns coming out of his head. The Hebrew can bear this connotation, but the Greek formalized it, and so we came into Latin. In fact, keren sounds much like cornu, horns in Latin, whence cornucopia. And that's where we get Michelangelo's Moses with the horns coming out of his head. And more tragic, in fact, a legend which I've still heard in Tennessee and I heard in North Carolina, that Jewish people have horns. And that's one of those Christian calumnies that's still around. Moral laws, ethical laws, encompass the majority of the mitzvot, the commandment. Care for the poor and the stranger, justice for everybody regardless of class, from the rich to the poor, honesty in the marketplace, peace in the family, and also holy war, because these laws concern not only morality in the home, but morality when one engages in war. And this brings us to the first major holy war played out in the book of Joshua. This is the story of what happens when the people leave the wilderness and they come into the land and they discover its inhabitants. They'll have to fight those inhabitants to take the land promised them. That's the next lecture.
All right, so there we are at the end of another lesson on Exodus. One more to go, and then we'll be rounding out the first two chapters, or I'm sorry, first two books of the Old Testament. We've gone a long ways in just a few months and covered a lot of material. Thanks for hanging in there. So recommended reading for next week is Exodus chapters 25 through 40. I know that's a lot. I don't necessarily believe everyone needs to read all of it, but just, give it a good college try, as they say. The main focus will be on getting materials together and building the tabernacle, which will house the presence of Yahweh as they move forward. So that, as we've seen, the theophany of Yahweh has been on the mountain of Sinai. In the future, we will see that the theophany of Yahweh will be within the tabernacle, or a portable Mount Sinai, if you want to look at it that way. Anyway, have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.